By devoting just 6 minutes each weekday for 1 year, you can read through the entire New Testament using David's servant's daily devotional, HeavenWord Daily. Order your copy at heavenword.tv.
Well, it's great to be back together once again, and we're, of course, continuing our chronological study through the entire New Testament. Our study takes us back today to Matthew chapter 22. And I'd like to start this time exactly where we left off last time, right around verse number 23. But just to set the stage real quickly here, Matthew highlights in this chapter several of Jesus' confrontations in the final days of his earthly life, before his crucifixion, with the religious leaders of Israel. They were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and the lawyers, and even some Herodians were thrown in there. And we've already read the first instance where the Pharisees and Herodians brought to Jesus, a question, and he used an object lesson holding up a coin and saying, whose inscription and likeness is on this coin, and ended it by saying, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God, render to God what is God. So we've covered that in detail. And so now we're at the next encounter, apparently right around the same time, Matthew chapter 22 and verse number 23. This is where we left off last time. On that day, some Sadducees, and then parenthetically, who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and questioned him, asking, "Teacher, Moses said," and then they quote from Deuteronomy, "If a man dies having no children, his brother, as next of kin, shall marry his wife and raise up children for his brother," end quote. Now, there were 7 brothers with us, and the first married, and he died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother, and also the second, and the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they had all married her. Now, interesting question, makes me feel rather sorry for the Sadducees, because as Matthew told his readers, they didn't believe there was a resurrection. So let's start right there. Should they have believed there was a resurrection? Well, certainly they should have believed it if they would have believed the Scripture. But their understanding, their theology was based upon their logic, and they've, given us a sample of their logic here. How could there be a resurrection? Because in these cases where people have been married, and then a woman's left as a widow who marries the brother of the deceased, and so on and so forth. There's big mix-up, when we get to the day of the resurrection. And so on that basis alone, we're going to eliminate the idea of the credibility of the resurrection. And like so many errors that are made in understanding the Lord and his plan, their critical error was that they exalted their logic above the Scripture. Always be careful. Now, God has given us a brain. We are to love him with all of our heart, mind, and soul and strength. So that doesn't mean we toss out our brains and that we never think logically when we want to interpret the Bible. But we have to make very certain that our logic doesn't supersede the Bible. Because why? Because God can do anything. And think about their logic. It was all based upon this very unlikely possibility of 7 brothers all dying without having children, being married to the same woman, and so forth. I mean, how often have you heard of such a thing happening? Very, very rare. But on the basis of this very rare occasion, if maybe impossible occasion, they've tossed out the whole doctrine of the resurrection. It's found in the Old Testament Scripture. Of course, it's found in the New Testament. Everybody who's read the New Testament, almost every Christian knows that the doctrine of the resurrection is fundamental to our faith, in that basically one day everybody, good and evil, righteous and unrighteous, will be resurrected. The components, the elements, whatever you want to call it, of their former bodies that have died and been buried or cremated and scattered around the globe via the air, God's going to recreate new bodies, and everyone will be resurrected. Now, their final fates are completely different, of course, but this is basic New Testament doctrine. But it's found in the Old Testament in numerous places, and the Sadducees, had they studied the Scripture, they'd have known that. Let me just cite a couple of them to you. This is from Isaiah chapter 26 and verse number 19. God said through Isaiah, "Your dead will live." their corpses will rise. That's pretty clear. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy, for your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits. That's pretty clear, isn't it? I mean, it does raise a few questions, but nevertheless, that's the resurrection. Then Job, during one of his long speeches there that are recorded in the book by his name. This is Job 19 and verse number 25. And Job says, as for me, and this he said this in the time of his great affliction, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. Verse 26, even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I will see God. Okay, so Job believed in the resurrection. Now, last but not least, this is one of the more well-known ones in Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. For the sake of time, we can only read verse number 2. You might want to check out verse number 1 later on. But God is speaking of the end times, and after that great time of distress that he says in verse number 1 of Daniel 12 that will be coming upon the earth. Verse number 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. These to everlasting life, speaking of the righteous, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So you see the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. All right, so there's three scriptures, we didn't have to look very far or hard to find them. The Sadducees, they're professing to be believers in what Moses wrote. In fact, they're quoting from what Moses wrote. But can you see their problem? They took something Moses wrote and ignored other things that were found in the scripture, Isaiah, Job, and Daniel, which they had at their disposal. Okay? And that's a mistake. As you've heard me say it over and over again, we don't want to make that mistake ourselves. Okay, now I want to talk a little more about this very interesting encounter with the Sadducees, and so very much looking forward to that. So I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.